In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a Hollywood star arrives, trailing glamour and secrets. Vivian Leroux, silver screen queen, steps into Gossington Hall, where an ancient mirror whispers a chilling prophecy. When the mirror shatters, the star shall fall, betrayed by the shadow that binds them all. Sound of glass shattering, a gasp. But when the mirror breaks, and screams pierce the night, Miss Jane Marple sees what others miss. Who wields the prophecy's curse? Is it the brooding co-star, the secretive assistant, or the director with a hidden past? Soft knitting needles click as fires blaze and truths unravel. One question burns. Will Miss Marple unmask the betrayer before the star falls forever? Heartbeat quickens, fades to silence. Dive into Shattered Mirror prophecy, where every reflection hides a deadly truth. Chapter 1. The rival of the start. Late summer sun dappled the cobblestone paths of St. Mary Mead, casting lazy shadows over the village green where roses bloomed with defiant cheer. It was the kind of morning that usually wrapped the village in a cocoon of predictable calm. Mrs. Price's terrier yapping at the postman, the vicar polishing his sermon, and the faint clink of teacups from cottage windows. But today, an electric hum stirred the air, as if the village itself had caught its breath. Hollywood had descended upon St. Mary Mead, and with it came Vivian Leroux, the silver-screen siren whose name alone conjured images of velvet gowns and smoldering glances. She was here to film The Crimson Veil, a period drama directed by her husband, Roland Vane, at the newly purchased Gossington Hall. And Miss Jane Marple, perched in Dolly Bantry's rose-draped parlor, was already knitting her way into the heart of the matter. "Oh, Jane, it's positively thrilling," Dolly Bantry exclaimed, her cheeks flushed as she poured tea from a chipped Wedgwood pot. "A real film star in our little village. Vivian Leroux, can you imagine? I saw her in Moonlit Betrayal last year. Those eyes, like she could see right through you. And now she's here, at Gossington Hall, no less." Arthur's beside himself. "Of course he says it's all nonsense, but I caught him polishing his old binoculars to sneak a peek." Miss Marple's needles clicked rhythmically, her mild blue eyes fixed on the skein of pale pink wool in her lap. "It is rather exciting, Dolly," she said, her voice soft but laced with that quiet acuity that never failed to unsettle those who underestimated her. "Though I dare say such glamour often brings complications. People like Miss Leroux carry their own little worlds with them, and those worlds are rarely as simple as they seem." Dolly laughed, waving a hand. "Oh, Jane, you and your suspicions. It's just a film crew. A bit of sparkle for St. Mary Mead. They're holding a fête tonight to welcome them. Everyone's invited. You must come. Vivian herself will speak. And I hear there's to be a special unveiling. Something about an antique from the hall." Miss Marple's needles paused, just for a moment. "An unveiling, you say? How curious. I suppose I might attend, if only to see what sort of people trail in Miss Leroux's wake. One learns so much from watching, don't you think?" Dolly, oblivious to the glint in her friend's eye, prattled on about the village's preparations. The fête was to be held on the sweeping lawns of Gossington Hall, transformed from its usual staid elegance into a stage for Hollywood's fleeting magic. Bunting in crimson and gold fluttered between ancient oaks, and trestle tables groaned under plates of scones, cucumber sandwiches, and Mrs. Gibbs's famous lemon drizzle cake. The villagers, from the butcher's boy to the vicar's wife, buzzed with anticipation, their usual routines upended by the promise of stardom brushing their lives. By dusk, the fête was in full swing. Lanterns cast a warm glow over the crowd, their chatter mingling with the clink of glasses and the occasional burst of laughter. Children darted between adults, clutching toffee apples, while the local band, a trio of earnest young men with a fiddle, a clarinet, and an accordion, played a jaunty tune that clashed delightfully with the sophistication of the occasion. Miss Marple, dressed in her best lavender cardigan and a neat straw hat, stood near the edge of the lawn, her sharp gaze sweeping over the scene. Dolly, resplendent in a slightly too tight emerald dress, tugged at her arm. "There she is," Dolly whispered, pointing toward the stone terrace where Vivian Leroux emerged like a vision from a dream. Vivian was a study in elegance. Her auburn hair swept into a chignon that gleamed under the lanterns. Her gown, a cascade of midnight blue silk, shimmered as she moved. And her eyes, those famous eyes, swept the crowd with a mix of warmth and imperious command. At her side stood Roland Vane, a weary man with sharp features and a restless energy. His dark suit impeccable, but his smile strained. Behind them trailed a small entourage, a young woman with a pinched face and a notebook, whom Miss Marple guessed was Clara, Vivian's assistant, and a tall, brooding man with matinee-idol looks, undoubtedly Leonard Drake, the film's co-star. Others hovered a burly grip named Tom, a wardrobe mistress with a nervous laugh, and a cluster of crew members who seemed both awestruck and wary of their leading lady. The crowd hushed as Vivian stepped to a makeshift podium, her voice carrying, like a melody over the lawn. "Dear friends of St. Mary Mead," she began, her accent a polished blend of American confidence and theatrical flourish. "I am honored to stand before you tonight, in this charming village, as we embark on a journey to bring the Crimson Veil to life. Gossington Hall, your treasure, is our home for the next few months, and I promise we shall treat it with the reverence it deserves." A polite ripple of applause followed, though Miss Marple noted a few skeptical glances among the villagers. Vivian's charm was undeniable, but there was something rehearsed in it, as if she were playing a role even now. The actress gestured to a draped object beside her, covered in a velvet cloth. "Tonight, I wish to share something special, a piece of history we discovered in the hall. It is an antique mirror, said to carry a prophecy from centuries past, a prophecy of truth, betrayal, and destiny." The crowd leaned forward, intrigued. Miss Marple's needles, tucked into her bag, seemed to itch for action. Prophecies, in her experience, were rarely as mystical as they seemed more often. They were tools for human mischief. Roland Vane stepped forward, pulling the cloth away. With a dramatic flourish, the mirror revealed was a magnificent piece, its gilded frame carved with intricate vines and roses, its surface gleaming like a still pond under moonlight. But what drew gasps was the inscription etched across its top, in letters that seemed to pulse with age. "When the mirror shatters, the star shall fall, betrayed by the shadow that binds them all." A murmur ran through the crowd, half excited, half uneasy. Vivian's smile faltered, just for a moment, as she traced a finger along the inscription. "This prophecy," she said, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper, "is said to foretell a great unraveling. We thought it fitting, for our film, which explores the shadows of the human heart. But tonight, let us celebrate new beginnings, not omens." The band struck up again, and the crowd relaxed, though whispers of the prophecy lingered. Miss Marple, however, was watching the entourage. Clara, the assistant, stood rigid, her eyes fixed on the mirror as if it might bite. Leonard Drake, leaning against a pillar, lit a cigarette with a trembling hand, his gaze darting to Vivian. Roland Vane, meanwhile, was deep in conversation with Tom the Grip, their heads bent close, their expressions tense. Something was afoot, Miss Marple thought. And it was not merely the excitement of a film star's rival. She drifted toward the refreshment table, where Mrs. Gibbs was holding court, her apron dusted with flour. "What do you make of that mirror, Miss Marple?" the baker asked, her eyes wide. "Prophecies and such. It's like something out of one of Miss LaRue's films." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, selecting a scone with care. "Though I suspect prophecies are often less about fate and more about the intentions of those who wield them. Tell me, Mrs. Gibbs, have you noticed anything unusual about our visitors?" Mrs. Gibbs leaned in, her voice dropping. "Well, I shouldn't say, but that Clara girl was in my shop yesterday, buying a dozen buns and looking like she'd seen a ghost. Kept muttering about keeping secrets. And that Mr. Drake, he was in the pub last night, drinking like he wanted to forget his own name, not to mention Mr. Vane, snapping at everyone like a man with something to hide." Miss Marple nodded, filing away the tidbits. The village, she knew, was a mirror of its own, reflecting truths its inhabitants often missed. She glanced back at the terrace, where Vivian was now mingling, her laughter bright but her eyes guarded. The actress was charming a group of villagers, including young Tommy Pierce, who blushed furiously as she signed his autograph book. But Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the mirror, still standing on the terrace, its surface catching the lantern light in a way that seemed almost alive. As the evening wore on, the fete grew merrier, with couples dancing and children sneaking extra slices of cake. Miss Marple, ever observant, stationed herself near a rosebush, where she could watch without being noticed. She saw Clara slip away from the crowd, clutching her notebook, and disappear into the hall. Leonard Drake, meanwhile, excused himself from a conversation with the vicar and followed, his steps purposeful. Miss Marple's lips pursed. Coincidences, in her experience, were rarely coincidental. She was about to follow when a commotion erupted on the terrace. A sharp, splintering crash cut through the music, followed by a collective gasp. The crowd surged forward, and Miss Marple, nimble despite her years, slipped through to see. The antique mirror lay in pieces, its gilded frame splintered, shards glittering on the stone floor like fallen stars. Vivian stood frozen, her hand pressed to her chest, her face pale as moonlight. Roland Vane cursed under his breath, while Clara, reappearing from the hall, let out a stifled cry. "Good heavens!" Dolly Bantry exclaimed, clutching Miss Marple's arm. "The mirror, it's shattered, just like the prophecy said." The crowd buzzed with whispers, some thrilled, some frightened. The vicar's wife crossed herself, muttering about curses, while Tommy Pierce declared it jolly exciting. Miss Marple, however, knelt carefully beside the wreckage, her eyes scanning the shards. The break was uneven, jagged in a way that suggested force, not accident. She noticed a faint smear of red on one piece, not blood, but something waxy, like lipstick or paint. Her gaze flicked to Vivian, whose lips were painted a deep crimson. Then to Clara, whose hands were twisting nervously in her skirt. "An unfortunate mishap," Roland Vane said loudly, stepping forward to calm the crowd. "A loose stand, no doubt. Let's not spoil the evening with superstition. Come, let's have another dance." The band resumed, but the mood had shifted. Villagers glanced at the broken mirror, their chatter now laced with unease. Vivian, recovering her composure, laughed lightly and returned to her admirers. But Miss Marple saw the tremor in her hands. Roland ushered the crew to clear the debris, his voice sharp as he ordered Clara to stop gawking and help. Leonard Drake, meanwhile, had vanished into the crowd. Miss Marple rose, brushing her hands. "Curious, don't you think, Dolly?" she said softly. A mirror that shatters just as its prophecy is revealed. One might almost think it was meant to happen. Dolly's eyes widened. You don't mean sabotage. I mean, Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but firm, that mirrors reflect what we choose to see. And someone, I suspect, chose to make this one break. As the fate continued, Miss Marple slipped into the hall, her steps quiet but purposeful. The grand foyer of Gossington Hall was a maze of film equipment, cameras, lights, and coils of cable, but her eyes were drawn to a side table where Clara's notebook lay abandoned. She opened it, her fingers deft, and found a single page marked with a hurried sketch, a jagged rune, like a lightning bolt crossed with a thorn. Below it, in Clara's neat hand, were the words, "The star must fall." Miss Marple closed the notebook, her mind racing. The prophecy, the mirror, the rune all pointed to a carefully staged drama, one that went beyond Hollywood theatrics. She thought of Vivian's guarded eyes, Clara's nervous glances, Leonard's trembling hands, and Roland's strained smiles. Each was a piece in a puzzle, and Miss Marple, with her knack for seeing patterns where others saw chaos, knew the truth was close. As she stepped back onto the lawn, the music swelled, and the villagers danced under the stars. But the night's magic had frayed, and the prophecy's shadow lingered. Miss Marple adjusted her hat, her expression serene but her mind alight. The mirror's shattering was no accident. She was certain someone had orchestrated this moment, and she would find out who and why. Then, as the band played its final notes, a piercing scream tore through the night, coming from the direction of the hall. The crowd froze, and Miss Marple's heart quickened. The game, it seemed, had only just begun. Chapter 2. The first scream tore through the twilight air of St. Mary Mead, sharp and jagged as the broken mirror at its source. It came from the garden of Gossington Hall, where the welcome fête for Vivian Leroux was winding down, the village's excitement curdling into unease. Miss Jane Marple, seated on a wicker chair beside her old friend Dolly Bantry, set her teacup down with deliberate calm, her pale blue eyes, sharp despite the soft lines of her face, scanned the crowd. The villagers, moments ago buzzing with gossip about Hollywood glamour, now stood frozen, their gazes locked on the figure of Clara Henshaw, Vivian's assistant, who stood trembling in the center of the lawn. Clara clutched a shard of the shattered mirror, its edges glinting wickedly in the fading light. Blood trickled from her palm, staining the grass, and her wide eyes darted as though searching for something or someone in the gathering dusk. It moved, she gasped, her voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying the weight of a confession. The mirror. It moved on its own. A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mix of skepticism and superstitious dread. The prophecy Vivian had unveiled earlier, etched in spidery script on the antique mirror, echoed in their minds. Betrayal shall shatter the star's light, and death shall follow in its wake. The mirror's sudden destruction during Vivian's speech splintering with a crack like a gunshot had already set tongues wagging. Now, Clara's words fanned the embers of fear. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, not in alarm but in curiosity. She adjusted her shawl, her fingers brushing the soft wool as she leaned toward Dolly. "Most peculiar," she murmured. "A mirror does not move of its own accord, nor does it bleed. There's a hand at work here, Dolly. And it's not a ghostly one." Dolly, her round face flushed from the evening's wine and drama, turned to her friend. "Jane, you don't think sabotage? Who'd dare, with all these people watching?" Her eyes flicked to the crowd, where villagers mingled uneasily with Vivian's entourage. The brooding co-star Leonard Drake, his dark hair falling over his brow as he whispered to a crew member. Roland Vane, the director, and Vivian's husband, his smile tight as he reassured guests, and Vivian herself, radiant in a cream silk gown. Though her laughter now sounded brittle. Someone bold, Miss Marple replied softly, or desperate. Her gaze lingered on Clara, who was being ushered toward a bench by a solicitous Mrs. Gibbs. The village busybody. The girl's face was pale, her auburn hair slipping from its neat bun, and her eyes held a flicker of something fear, perhaps, or calculation. Miss Marple's fingers twitched, as if itching to unravel a knot. The fête dissolved into chaos. Villagers clustered in knots, whispering about curses and Hollywood scandals. Vivian, ever the actress, swept toward Clara, her voice carrying over the murmurs. "My dear, what happened? Are you hurt?" Her concern was theatrical, her hands fluttering like doves. But Miss Marple noted the quick glance Vivian shot toward Roland, who stood rigid by the garden's rose trellis. Clara, cradling her bloodied hand, shook her head. I picked up a piece of the mirror, and it felt alive, like it cut me on purpose." Her words faltered, and she swayed, prompting a gasp from the onlookers. Dr. Haydock, the village physician, pushed through the crowd, his black bag in hand. "Let me see," he said briskly, kneeling beside Clara. He examined her palm, his brow furrowing. "A clean cut, but deep. You'll need stitches." "What were you thinking?" Grabbing broken glass. Clara's eyes darted to the shard, now lying on the grass, its surface catching the torchlight. "I didn't mean to. It was like it called to me." Her voice dropped, barely audible. The prophecy. The words sent a shiver through the crowd. Miss Marple, however, was more interested in the shard itself. She rose, her movements deceptively frail, and approached the scene, her sensible shoes silent on the grass. "May I?" she asked Dr. Haydock, who glanced up, surprised but acquiescent. He handed her the shard, wrapped in his handkerchief. Miss Marple held it delicately, tilting it to catch the light. The glass was heavy, old, its edges beveled in a style not seen in modern mirrors. Etched into its surface was a faint symbol, not part of the prophecy's text, a jagged rune, like a lightning bolt crossed with a crescent moon. She frowned, her mind sifting through memories of ancient scripts glimpsed in dusty books. Curious, she murmured. Ellie, hovering at her side, peered over her shoulder. "What's that, Jane?" "Part of the prophecy." "Not quite," Miss Marple said, her tone light but her eyes keen. "It's a rune, I believe. An old one, not commonly seen. It speaks of deceit, if I'm not mistaken." She glanced at Clara, who was now being bandaged by Dr. Haydock. The girl's face was a mask of distress, but her eyes flicked toward the shard, then away, too quickly. Roland Vane strode over, his polished shoes gleaming. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry, perhaps you should leave this to the professionals. Clara's had a shock, and we don't need more rumors." His voice was smooth, but there was an edge to it, like a blade wrapped in velvet. "Oh, I quite agree," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "Rumors are such troublesome things. But facts, Mr. Vane, they have a way of cutting through." She handed the shard back to Dr. Haydock, who tucked it into his bag for safekeeping. As the crowd dispersed, Miss Marple and Dolly returned to their chairs, the air now thick with the scent of roses and suspicion. Dolly leaned close, her voice low. "Jane, you don't think Clara's making it up, do you?" That scream was real enough to curdle milk. "Real? Yes," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking as she resumed her knitting. A soft gray scarf taking shape. But real fear can mask other truths. Clara's story is convenient. A shattered mirror, a bleeding hand. A prophecy. It's all rather dramatic, don't you think? Dolly's eyes widened. You mean she staged it? But why? Miss Marple's smile was faint. People stage dramas for all sorts of reasons, Dolly. Attention, distraction, revenge. We shall see. The next morning, Gossington Hall was a hive of activity. The film crew had arrived at dawn, setting up cameras and lights for the period drama. The Lady's Secret, a tale of betrayal and forbidden love that had drawn Vivian Leroux to St. Mary Mead. Dolly, as the hall's former owner, had been invited to observe, and she'd insisted Miss Marple come along. You'll see things I won't, Jane, she'd said over breakfast. You always do. The hall's grand drawing room was transformed into a Regency-era set, with velvet drapes and flickering candelabras. Vivian, in a flowing gown, rehearsed a scene with Leonard Drake, whose dark eyes smoldered as he delivered his lines. But the atmosphere was taut. The crew's banter forced. Miss Marple, seated in a corner with a cup of tea, watched as Clara, her hand bandaged, hovered near Vivian, her expression unreadable. Roland called a break, and Vivian swept toward Miss Marple, her smile dazzling. Miss Marple, how kind of you to visit our little circus. What do you think of our set? It's quite splendid, Miss Marple said, her tone warm but her eyes noting the faint strain in Vivian's face. Though I imagine it's difficult, working under such unusual circumstances. Vivian's laugh was a touch too bright. Oh, you mean the mirror nonsense. Just a silly accident. Clara's young, impressionable. She let the prophecy get to her. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, sipping her tea. But the rune on that shard, it's not something one sees every day. Do you know its origin? Vivian's smile faltered, just for a moment. Rune? Oh, I'm sure it's just some old decoration. The mirror was an antique. After all, Roland found it in a London shop. Thought it'd add mystique to the film. Indeed, Miss Marple said, her needles clicking. And yet, someone went to the trouble of carving that rune. Freshly, I might add. The edges were sharp, not worn by time. Vivian's eyes narrowed. But before she could respond, Clara approached, carrying a script. Miss Leroux, your lines for the next scene, she said, her voice steady but her gaze flickering to Miss Marple. Thank you, Clara, Vivian said, taking the script. She turned back to Miss Marple, her smile restored. You must excuse me, Miss Marple. Duty calls. As Vivian glided away, Miss Marple watched Clara linger, her fingers twisting the edge of her bandage. Miss Henshaw, Miss Marple said, gently, you seem troubled. Is there something you'd like to share? Clara started, her cheeks flushing. No, I'm fine. Just shaken from last night. She hesitated, then added, the mirror, it wasn't an accident, was it? Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her voice was firm. I suspect not. Mirrors break, of course, but they don't carve themselves with runes. Tell me, Clara, did you notice anything odd before the fête? Anyone near the mirror? Clara's lips parted, then closed. I was busy with Miss Leroux's preparations. I didn't see anything. She turned away, hurrying toward the set. Miss Marple's needles paused. Interesting, she murmured to herself. Clara's hesitation was a thread, thin but tangible, and she would follow it. That afternoon, Dolly invited Miss Marple to tea at her cottage. where the village gossip flowed as freely as the Earl Grey. Mrs. Gibbs, her eyes bright with excitement, recounted the fate's events to a small circle of neighbors. "That mirror breaking, it's a sign. Mark my words. Hollywood folk bring trouble wherever they go. And that Clara," saying it moved. "I saw her pick up that shard, bold as brass, like she wanted to be seen." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression serene. "Mrs. Gibbs, you have a keen eye. Did you notice anyone else near the mirror before it broke?" Mrs. Gibbs puffed up, pleased. "Well, now that you mention it, I did see that Leonard Drake fellow skulking about. Looked like he was arguing with someone, couldn't see who, mind you. And then there's Tom, the grip, shifty sort, always muttering to himself." "Tom?" Dolly asked, her brow furrowing. "The one who helped set up the fête?" "The very same," Mrs. Gibbs said, nodding. "He was carrying that mirror in, wasn't he? If anyone had a chance to tamper with it, it's him." Miss Marple filed the information away, her mind turning like a well-oiled machine. Tom, Leonard, Claire, each a piece in a puzzle that was only beginning to take shape. The rune, she suspected, was the key. Its presence suggested intent, perhaps knowledge of arcane symbols, which pointed to someone educated or with access to specific resources. That evening, Miss Marple persuaded Dolly to accompany her back to Gossington Hall, ostensibly to retrieve a forgotten shawl, but in truth to examine the scene of the mirror's destruction. The garden was quiet now, the fate's debris cleared away, but the pedestal where the mirror had stood remained, its surface scuffed and splintered. Miss Marple knelt, her knees protesting, and peered at the pedestal's base. "Look here, Dolly," she said, pointing to a faint scratch, barely visible in the moonlight. "This mark, it's deliberate, like a tool was used to weaken the stand. The mirror didn't fall. It was made to fall." Dolly gasped. "You mean someone planned it? But who?" "Someone who wanted the prophecy to seem real," Miss Marple said, rising with a wince, "and who knew its effect would be immediate fear, suspicion, chaos. A clever distraction, perhaps, from something else." As they returned to the hall, a light flickered in an upstairs window, brief but unmistakable. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Dolly, I think we should call on Mr. Vane tomorrow. I have a few questions about that mirror's provenance." They were halfway to the gate when a rustling in the bushes made them pause. Dolly clutched Miss Marple's arm, her voice a whisper. "Jane, did you hear that?" Before Miss Marple could respond, a figure darted from the shadows, cloaked in dark fabric, and vanished into the night. Dolly's grip tightened. Good heavens, was that a person, not a ghost? Miss Marple said firmly, though her heart beat a little faster, and one with something to hide. The next morning, as Miss Marple sat in her parlor, knitting and pondering, a knock at the door announced Inspector Craddock, his face grim. "Miss Marple, I've just had a call from Gossington Hall. Clara Henshaw's gone missing. Left a note saying she's searching for the truth in the reflection, whatever that means." Miss Marple's needles stilled. "The truth in the reflection," she repeated softly. "I suspect, Inspector, that Clara knows more than she's let on, and someone else knows it too." As Craddock left to organize a search, Miss Marple's mind raced. The rune, the shattered mirror, Clara's disappearance. It was a tapestry of deceit, woven with care. And somewhere, in the threads of St. Mary, Mead's quiet lanes and Hollywood's glittering shadows, lay the truth. Chapter 3. Shadows on the set. Morning mist clung to the cobblestones of St. Mary Mead, a delicate shroud that softened the village's edges. but did little to quell the electric hum of anticipation. Gossington Hall, its ancient stone facade, now adorned with scaffolding and lighting rigs, loomed like a grand dame reluctantly hosting a circus. The film crew had descended at dawn, their vans and cables snaking through the estate's manicured lawns, transforming the quiet grandeur into a chaotic stage for Hollywood's latest spectacle. The Gilded Betrayal, Roland Vane's period drama, was underway, and the village buzzed with the novelty of it all. Miss Jane Marple, perched on a folding chair near the rose garden, observed the scene with her usual unobtrusive keenness. Her knitting needles clicked rhythmically, a soft counterpoint to the cacophony of shouted directions and whirring equipment. Dolly Bantry, her friend and the former mistress of Gossington Hall, sat beside her, fanning herself with a folded newspaper. "It's like a zoo, Jane," Dolly remarked, her voice a mix of exasperation and delight. "All this fuss for a few minutes of film. And Vivian LaRue, can you believe she's here? In our little village." Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, followed the flurry of activity. Vivian LaRue, the silver-screened siren, whose face had graced 1,000 posters, was at the center of it all, her auburn hair catching the sunlight as she rehearsed a scene in a crimson gown. Her co-star, Leonard Drake, stood opposite, his brooding features set in a scowl as he delivered lines with a clipped intensity. Roland Vane, the director and Vivian's husband, paced nearby, barking orders through a megaphone. The crew scurried like ants, adjusting lights and props, while villagers lingered at the estate's gates, hoping for a glimpse of stardom. "It's rather like watching a play before the curtain rises," Miss Marple mused, her fingers pausing mid-stitch. "All the players are in place, but the script feels incomplete." Dolly raised an eyebrow. "Incomplete? Jane, you're already sniffing out a mystery, aren't you? It's just a film set. Chaos is part of the package." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her tone mild but her gaze lingering on Leonard Drake. His scowl had deepened, and he was gesticulating sharply at Roland. "But chaos has a way of revealing patterns, if one knows where to look." The morning's shooting was focused on a pivotal scene, a heated confrontation between Vivian's character, Lady Eleanor, and Leonard's Lord Reginald, set in a candlelit ballroom. The set, constructed inside Gossington Hall's Grand Hall, was a marvel of opulence, gilded mirrors, velvet drapes, and a chandelier that sparkled like a constellation. Yet, the atmosphere was anything but serene. Roland's voice cut through the air, sharp and impatient. "Leonard, more passion. You're supposed to be betrayed, not bored." Leonard's jaw tightened. "Maybe I'd feel it more if the script didn't keep changing," he snapped, his voice carrying to where Miss Marple and Dolly sat. "This scene, it's too close to the bone. You know why?" Vivian, adjusting her gown, shot Leonard a look that was equal parts ice and fire. "Darling, it's acting. If it's too much for you, perhaps Roland can find someone with thicker skin." The crew fell silent, the tension palpable. Roland lowered his megaphone, his face a mask of controlled frustration. "Enough. We're breaking for 10. Sort yourselves out." Miss Marple's needles resumed their dance, but her mind was elsewhere. Leonard's words, "too close to the bone," echoed in her thoughts. She recalled the village gossip, whispered over teacups at the Blue Boar. Vivian's meteoric rise in Hollywood had been dogged by rumors of a scandal, a betrayal that had ruined another actress's career. The rewritten scene, it seemed, was stirring old wounds. Dolly leaned closer, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "Did you hear that? Jane, trouble in paradise." I bet Leonard's got a chip on his shoulder about Vivian stealing the spotlight. Or perhaps, Miss Marple said softly, the script is unearthing something neither of them wishes to revisit. As the crew dispersed for the break, Miss Marple's attention shifted to a weary figure in overalls, lugging a coil of cable across the lawn. Tom, the grip, was a local lad, hired for the production due to his familiarity with the estate. His face was set in a perpetual frown, and he moved with the restless energy of someone carrying a grudge. Miss Marple had noticed him earlier, muttering to a colleague about the cursed production. Now, as he passed a cluster of props, he paused, glancing furtively at a wooden crate labeled ballroom scene. "Dolly," Miss Marple said, her voice low, "do you suppose Tom's discontent is merely about the disruption to his routine, or something more?" Dolly followed her gaze. "Tom? He's always been a bit surly. Probably doesn't like all these city types trampling his village." "Why? What are you thinking?" Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. Instead, she rose, tucking her knitting into her bag. "I believe I'll take a closer look at the set. The air feels unsettled." Dolly chuckled. "Unsettled? Jane, you're incorrigible. Go on, then. I'll stay here and guard the biscuits." The set was a labyrinth of props and cables, and Miss Marple navigated it with the quiet grace of a cat. She paused near the wooden crate, noting its slightly ajar lid. Inside, she glimpsed a collection of props, candelabras, a velvet cloak, and a gleaming dagger with an ornate hilt. It was a prop, of course, meant for the dramatic climax of the ballroom scene, but its edge caught the light in a way that seemed too sharp. Before she could investigate further, a shadow fell across the crate. Tom stood there, his hands shoved into his pockets, his eyes narrowing. "What are you doing, poking around?" he asked, his tone more defensive than curious. Miss Marple smiled, her expression disarming. "Oh, just admiring the craftsmanship. This dagger, for instance, quite realistic, isn't it?" Tom shifted uncomfortably. "It's just a prop. Nothing special." He hesitated, then added, "You shouldn't be here. Crew only." "Of course," Miss Marple said, stepping back. "I wouldn't dream of interfering. Though, I must say, it's a pity about the mirror at the fête. Such a curious incident." Tom's face darkened. "Curious? Yeah. Whole production's cursed, if you ask me. Things breaking, people fighting, bad omens." He turned away abruptly, busying himself with a nearby cable. Miss Marple watched him go, her mind cataloging the encounter. Tom's unease, Leonard's outburst, the rewritten script, it all pointed to a deeper undercurrent, one tied to the shattered mirror and its cryptic prophecy. She made her way back to Dolly, her thoughts swirling like the mist that still clung to the village. The afternoon's shooting resumed with a strained air. Vivian and Leonard performed their scene, their chemistry crackling but brittle, like glass on the verge of breaking. Roland's directions grew sharper, his patience fraying. Miss Marple, now seated closer to the set, noticed a young woman in a headset, Clara, Vivian's assistant, hovering at the edges, her eyes darting nervously. Clara had been scarce since the fête, her bandaged hand a reminder of the bloodied shard she'd clutched. Miss Marple made a mental note to speak with her, but the opportunity didn't come. As the crew prepared for a new take, a shout rang out. "Where's the dagger?" The prop master, a harried man named George, was rummaging through the crate, his face flushed. "It was here an hour ago." Roland stormed over, his megaphone dangling at his side. "What do you mean? It's gone. We need it for the next shot." George shook his head. I checked it myself this morning. Someone's taken it, the crew murmured, glances darting toward Leonard, who stood rigid, his arms crossed. Vivian, adjusting her gloves, said coolly, perhaps it's another omen. The prophecy does love its theatrics. Miss Marple's fingers tightened on her knitting bag. A missing prop was one thing, but a sharpened dagger was another. She slipped away from the set, her steps purposeful, and returned to the crate under the pretense of retrieving a dropped stitch. The lid was still ajar, and a quick glance confirmed the dagger's absence. But something else caught her eye, a scrap of fabric, caught on a splintered edge of the crate. It was a deep green, like the lining of a costume trunk she'd seen earlier, tucked away in the hall's anteroom. Dolly, Miss Marple said, returning to her friend, I believe I'll take a stroll through the costume department. Would you care to join me? Dolly's eyes sparkled. You've found something, haven't you? Lead on. Jane. The costume department, housed in a converted parlor, was a riot of silk and satin. Racks of gowns and tailcoats lined the walls. Overseen by Jenny, a young seamstress with quick fingers and a nervous smile, Miss Marple, feigning interest in a velvet cape, casually mentioned the missing dagger. Jenny's smile faltered, her hands pausing mid-stitch. Dagger. I wouldn't know anything about that, she said, her voice a shade too high. Of course not, Miss Marple said kindly, though I did notice a lovely green fabric in the prop crate. It reminded me of the trunks here. Such a distinctive shade. Jenny's face paled, and she busied herself with a pile of lace. Miss Marple didn't press, but her eyes lingered on a trunk in the corner, its lid slightly askew. She thanked Jenny and moved on, her mind piecing together the puzzle. The trunk, she suspected, held more than costumes. That evening, as the crew wrapped for the day, Miss Marple returned to the parlor alone. The trunk was unlocked, and inside, nestled among petticoats, was the missing dagger. Its blade gleamed, not with the dull sheen of a prop, but with the lethal edge of a real weapon. She wrapped it carefully in her handkerchief, her heart quickening. Someone had intended harm, whether to frighten or to kill, she couldn't yet say. As she emerged from the parlor, she nearly collided with Tom, who was carrying a stack of lighting gels. His eyes widened at the bundle in her hands. What's that? He demanded. Just a bit of tidying, Miss Marple said, her tone serene. Props do have a way of wandering, don't they? Tom muttered something unintelligible and hurried off. Miss Marple tucked the dagger into her bag, her mind racing. The prophecy, the rune, the sharpened dagger, it was all part of a carefully staged drama, one that threatened to spill into reality. And at its heart was Vivian Leroux, a star whose brilliance cast long shadows as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting Gossington Hall in a golden glow. Miss Marple returned to Dolly's side. Well? Dolly asked, her eyes gleaming with curiosity. Miss Marple smiled faintly. I believe, Dolly, that our little village is hosting more than a film. There's a story unfolding, and I intend to read its next chapter. That night, as St. Mary Mead settled into its usual quiet, a phone call shattered the silence at Dolly's cottage. It was Clara, her voice trembling over the line. She was at the Blackthorn Inn, a mile from the village, and she was certain someone was watching her. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind already turning to the inn, the rune, and the shadows that seemed to follow Vivian's every step. The prophecy, it seemed, was far from finished. The set of the Gilded Betrayal was a microcosm of ambition and secrets, each player hiding their true motives behind a mask of professionalism. Miss Marple, with her unassuming air and relentless curiosity, was determined to peel back those masks. The missing dagger, now safely hidden in her bag, was a tangible clue, but it was the intangible, the whispers, the glances, the rewritten lines that told her the real story was only beginning to unfold. She thought of Leonard's outburst, his cryptic reference to the script's changes. The scene, as she'd overheard, involved Lady Eleanor confessing to a betrayal that had destroyed her rival's life. It was a plot point that mirrored the rumors about Vivian's past, and Leonard's discomfort suggested he knew more than he let on. Was he protecting someone, or hiding his own role in the drama? Then there was Tom, the grip, whose surly demeanor masked a deeper unease. His talk of a cursed production felt less like superstition and more like a deliberate attempt to stir fear. And Clara, poor, nervous Clara, whose bandaged hand and cryptic note hinted at a connection to the prophecy. That went beyond mere coincidence. As Miss Marple sat by the fire that evening, knitting a scarf that grew longer with each passing thought, she considered the rune carved into the shattered mirror's shard. Deceit. She had identified it as a symbol that pointed to an educated mind, someone with access to arcane knowledge. The rare book in Vivian's library, glimpsed during her visit to Gossington Hall, was a thread she intended to follow. But for now, the dagger was her focus, a prop turned weapon, hidden with intent. The village of St. Mary Mead, with its quaint cottages and nosy neighbors, was no stranger to secrets. But this production, with its Hollywood glitter and ominous undertones, was unlike anything Miss Marple had encountered. The prophecy's shadow loomed large, and she knew that the next act, Clara's plea from the inn, would bring her closer to the truth. With a final stitch, Miss Marple set her knitting aside. Tomorrow, she would visit the Blackthorn Inn, where Clara waited, and where the next piece of the puzzle lay hidden. The prophecy, she suspected, was not a curse but a carefully crafted lie, and she was determined to shatter it before it claimed its next victim. Chapter 4. The insecret morning mist clung to St. Mary Mead like a gossamer veil, softening the edges of the village's thatched roofs and cobblestone paths. Miss Jane Marple, her sensible wool coat buttoned against the autumn chill, walked briskly toward the Blue Boar Inn. Her mind, sharp as ever, churned over the events of the past days. The shattered mirror at Gossington Hall, the cryptic prophecy, and Clara's sudden disappearance after the fête. The young assistant's note, left behind in her hurried flight, had been brief but chilling. The truth is in the reflection. Miss Marple's intuition, honed by years of observing human nature, told her that Clara's fear was no act. The Blue Boar Inn, a squat, ivy-covered building at the village's edge, was an anomaly in St. Mary Mead's quaint landscape. Its dark timber beams and low ceilings gave it an air of secrecy, as if it hoarded the whispers of every traveler who passed through. As Miss Marple pushed open the heavy oak door, a brass bell jangled above, announcing her arrival. The innkeeper, Mr. Pym, a weary man with a perpetual squint, looked up from polishing a glass behind the counter. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice a mix of surprise and wariness. "Didn't expect you here so early. Tea, perhaps?" "No, thank you, Mr. Pym," she replied, her tone polite but firm. "I'm here to see Miss Clara. I understand she's taken a room." Pym's squint deepened, his fingers pausing on the glass. She's upstairs. Room 7. Bit of a state. That one. Came in last night, pale as a ghost, muttering about being followed." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes scanning the dimly lit common room. A few locals sat at tables, their breakfast plates half-eaten, their conversation hushed. The air carried the scent of stale ale and wood smoke, tinged with something else tension, perhaps. She climbed the narrow staircase, her steps deliberate, her mind cataloging every detail. The creak of the third step, the faint scuff mark on the banister, the distant sound of a door closing. Room 7 was at the end of a short hallway, its door slightly ajar. Miss Marple knocked softly, her knuckles barely grazing the wood. "Miss Clara, it's Jane Marple. May I come in?" A rustle came from within, followed by a hesitant, "Yes, please." Clara sat on the edge of a narrow bed, her auburn hair disheveled, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The room was sparsely furnished, a rickety chair, a chipped washbasin, a single window overlooking the misty fields. Clara's eyes, red-rimmed and wide, darted to Miss Marple, then to the door, as if expecting someone else to burst through. "Miss Marple," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know who else to turn to. I had to leave the hall. It wasn't safe." Miss Marple settled into the chair, her posture calm but alert. "My dear, you must tell me everything. Your note mentioned a reflection. What did you mean?" Clara's fingers twisted the hem of her sweater, her gaze dropping to the floor. "It's the mirror. The one Vivian showed at the fête. I know it sounds mad, but it moved. Not just when it shattered, but before. I saw something in it, something that wasn't there. And then the letters started." "Letters?" Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes bright with interest. "What letters?" Clara reached under the bed, pulling out a small tin box. She opened it with trembling hands, revealing 3 envelopes, each sealed with a wax stamp bearing the same rune Miss Marple had seen on the shattered sharda. Jagged, spiraling symbol that seemed to writhe under scrutiny. Clara handed them over, her breath hitching. "They came to the hall, addressed to me," she said. "No postmark, no signature, just this rune. And the words inside, they talk about a star's fall. They say Vivian's time is coming. That betrayal will bring her down. I thought it was a prank at first, but after the mirror broke, I couldn't stay." Miss Marple opened the first letter, her fingers careful not to smudge the ink. The handwriting was elegant, almost too precise, as if the writer had taken pains to disguise their natural script. "The star will fall when the mirror speaks. Betrayal is the blade, and the shadow waits." The second letter was more direct. "She cannot escape her past. The reflection knows." The third, the most recent, chilled Miss Marple's blood. "Flee, or you'll fall with her." "These are no idle threats," Miss Marple said, folding the letters carefully. "Have you shown them to anyone else? Mr. Vane, perhaps, or Miss Leroux?" Clara shook her head. "No, Vivian's been strange since we arrived. She's obsessed with that mirror, says it's her lucky charm. And Roland, he's too busy with the film. He'd think I'm hysterical. But Miss Marple, I swear someone's watching me. Last night, I saw a shadow outside my window, a cloaked figure, just standing there." Miss Marple's mind flickered to Mrs. Gibbs, the village busybody, who had mentioned a cloaked figure near the inn at yesterday's market. Mrs. Gibbs was prone to exaggeration, but her gossip often held a kernel of truth. "Did you see their face?" Miss Marple asked. "No, it was too dark. But they were tall. And the cloak. It was heavy, like something from one of Vivian's films." Clara's voice cracked. "I think they know I have the letters. What if they come for me?" Miss Marple placed a reassuring hand on Clara's arm. "You're safe here, for now. But we must be cautious. Tell me, my dear, have you noticed anything unusual about the film's crew?" anyone who seemed particularly interested in the mirror or the prophecy. Clara hesitated, her brow furrowing. There's Tom, the grip. He's always lurking, listening. He asked me about the mirror once, said it gave him the creeps. And Leonard, Mr. Drake, he's been acting strange, too. He and Vivian had a row on set yesterday. Something about a script change. He looked scared. Miss Marple nodded, filing away the names. Leonard Drake, the brooding co-star with a reputation for volatility, and Tom, the crew member whose muttered comment about a cursed production had reached her ears at Gossington Hall. Both warranted closer scrutiny, but her immediate concern was Clara's safety and the letters. May I keep these for now? Miss Marple asked, holding up the envelopes. I'd like to examine them further. Clara nodded, relief flickering across her face. Please, just don't tell anyone I'm here. Not yet. I'll be discreet, Miss Marple promised. She rose, smoothing her coat. Stay in your room, lock the door, and don't open it for anyone you don't know. I'll return this afternoon. As Miss Marple descended the stairs, the inn's common room had grown livelier. A group of film crew members, recognizable by their modern jackets and weary expressions, occupied a corner table. Among them was Tom, his broad shoulders hunched over a pint. His eyes flicked toward Miss Marple, then away, too quickly to be casual. She made a mental note to speak with him later. Outside, the mist had thickened, curling around the inn like a living thing. Miss Marple walked toward the village center, her umbrella tapping the cobblestones. Her destination was the vicarage, where the Reverend Clement kept a small but eclectic library. If the rune on the letters matched the one in Vivian's library, as she suspected, it might point to a specific book and a specific culprit. The vicarage was a tidy stone house, its garden bursting with late-blooming roses. Mrs. Clement, a plump woman with a penchant for matchmaking, greeted Miss Marple at the door. Jane, what brings you here? Not another mystery, I hope. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling. Just a bit of research, Griselda. Is the vicar in? The Reverend Clement, a scholarly man with a perpetually distracted air, was in his study, surrounded by bookshelves that sagged under the weight of theological tomes and obscure histories. Miss Marple, he said, peering over his spectacles. To what do I owe the pleasure? I'm looking for something on ancient symbols, she said, producing one of Clara's letters and pointing to the rune. This, in particular. It's rather distinctive. Clement's eyes lit up, his scholarly instincts piqued. He rummaged through a stack of books, muttering to himself, before pulling out a slim volume bound in cracked leather. Runes and Their Mysteries. The title. Read, authored by a Dr. Elias Hawthorne. He flipped to a page marked with a ribbon, revealing a chart of angular symbols. There, he said, tapping the page. That's your rune. It's called Ansus, associated with communication and deceit. Quite rare, mind you. You'd need access to a specialized collection to know it. Miss Marple's lips pursed. A collection like the one at Gossington Hall, perhaps? Clement raised an eyebrow. Possibly. The Bantrys never struck me as collectors of esoterica, but Vivian LaRue's been known to dabble in the occult. Her films often have that flair. Miss Marple thanked him, tucking the letter back into her bag. The rune's connection to Vivian's library was no coincidence. Someone with access to Gossington Hall and knowledge of its contents was behind the threats. But who? Roland Vane, desperate to keep his film on track. Leonard Drake, hiding a personal grudge. Or Tom, the quiet grip with too many overheard whispers? Her thoughts were interrupted by a commotion in the village square. Mrs. Gibbs, her arms laden with market baskets, was holding court near the post office, her voice carrying over the crowd. I saw it with my own eyes, I tell you. A cloaked figure, skulking by the inn last night. Up to no good, mark my words. Miss Marple approached, her expression mild. Good morning, Mrs. Gibbs. You mentioned a figure near the Blue Boar. Can you describe them? Mrs. Gibbs puffed up, delighted to have an audience. Tall, they were, and thin. Wore a long cloak, dark as pitch, with a hood pulled low. Moved, like they didn't want to be seen, slipping into the alley by the inn. I'd wager they're tied to that Hollywood nonsense at the hall. Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. The description matched Clara's account, but it was vague enough to fit half a dozen people. She thanked Mrs. Gibbs and continued toward Gossington Hall, determined to inspect Vivian's library herself. The hall was a hive of activity when she arrived. Film crew members darted about, carrying lights and cables, while Roland Vane barked orders from the front steps. Dolly Bantry, ever the gracious host, spotted Miss Marple and waved her inside. Jane, you're a sight for sore eyes. This place is a madhouse. Care for a cuppa? In a moment, Dolly. Miss Marple said, I'd like to see the library, if I may. There's a book I'm curious about. Dolly led her to the library, a grand room with oak-paneled walls and floor-to-ceiling shelves. The air smelled of old leather and wax polish. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the titles, landing on a familiar spine. Runes and Their Mysteries. She pulled it down, flipping to the page on Ansu's. The runes stared back at her, identical to the one on Clara's letters. Dolly, Miss Marple said, closing the book. Who has access to this room? Dolly frowned, thinking. The family, of course, and the staff. Vivian's been in here often, poking through books for inspiration. Roland, too, though he's more interested in the brandy decanter. And Clara, naturally, as her assistant. Miss Marple's mind ticked over the possibilities. Clara herself was unlikely to have sent the letters she was too frightened, too vulnerable. But someone close to Vivian, someone with a motive to unsettle her, had chosen this rune deliberately. The question was why. As they left the library, a shout echoed from the drawing room. Miss Marple and Dolly hurried toward the sound, finding Vivian Leroux in a state of agitation. The actress stood before a gilt-framed mirror, not the one she'd brought to the fête, but a similar antique from the hall's collection. Her hands trembled as she pointed at it. It's happening again, Vivian cried, her voice shrill. I saw it, a face, not mine, in the glass. The prophecy is real, I tell you. Roland, at her side, looked exasperated. Vivian, darling, it's nerves. The film, the pressure, it's getting to you. Miss Marple stepped closer, her eyes narrowing as she studied the mirror. The glass was clear, unblemished, but a faint smudge marred its edge, barely visible. She ran a finger along it, feeling a slick residue. Wax, perhaps, or something more sinister. Miss Leroux, she said gently, when did you first notice this face? Vivian's eyes darted to her, then away. Last night, after Clara left. I couldn't sleep, so I came down here. I looked in the mirror, and there it was, pale, eyeless, like a ghost. It's the prophecy, Miss Marple. It's coming for me. Miss Marple's expression remained calm, but her mind was alight. Vivian's fear was genuine, but her story felt rehearsed, as if she were playing a role. Was she amplifying the prophecy for publicity, or was she truly haunted by her past? And what of the smudge deliberate, or a careless mistake by the culprit? Dolly, Miss Marple said, turning to her friend, I think it's time we had a word with Inspector Craddock. This business is growing more serious by the hour. As they left the drawing room, Miss Marple glanced back at the mirror. The smudge glinted faintly in the light, a silent clue in a game of shadows and deceit. Clara's safety, Vivian's fear. The rune's dark promise all were threads in a tapestry she was determined to unravel. But first, she needed to ensure Clara returned to Gossington Hall. The inn, for all its coziness, was no longer safe. The afternoon passed in a blur of activity. Miss Marple persuaded Clara to return to the hall, promising to keep her close. Inspector Craddock, summoned by Dolly, arrived with his usual blend of skepticism and respect for Miss Marple's instincts. He took the letters, promising to have them analyzed, though Miss Marple suspected the answers lay closer to home as evening fell. The hall's atmosphere grew heavier. The crew wrapped filming early, their faces drawn with fatigue and unease. Miss Marple sat in the drawing room, knitting quietly, her eyes flitting from Vivian's nervous pacing to Roland's forced cheer to Leonard's sullen silence. Tom lingered in the doorway, his gaze fixed on Clara, who clutched a cup of tea as if it were a lifeline. Then a crash shattered the silence. Clara screamed, her cup falling to the floor. Miss Marple was on her feet in an instant, following the sound to the hallway. There, at the foot of the staircase, lay a small mirror, its glass fractured into a spiderweb of cracks. Above it, scrawled in red chalk, was the rune Antzus. Someone was here, Clara whispered, her voice trembling. I heard footsteps, then the crash. They're watching me, Miss Marple. They know I'm back. Miss Marple knelt beside the mirror, her gloved hand brushing the chalk. It was fresh, still powdery. Whoever had done this was bold and close. She glanced at the assembled faces. Vivian, pale and shaken. Roland, his jaw tight. Leonard, avoiding her gaze. Tom, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. Inspector, she called softly, I think we have a vandal in our midst. As Craddock began questioning the group, Miss Marple's mind turned to the rune, the letters, the cloaked figure. The prophecy was a distraction, she was certain, but its purpose was not yet clear. Was it revenge, as Clara's fear suggested, or something more personal, tied to Vivian's glittering, shadowed past? One thing was certain. The truth lay not in the reflection, but in the hands that shattered it. Chapter 5. A poisoned chaliced late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Gossington Hall, its golden rays glinting off the tall windows as if trying to pierce the secrets. Within, St. Mary Mead, usually a sleepy hamlet, thrummed with an undercurrent of unease. The shattered mirror, the cryptic prophecy, and Clara's sudden collapse had woven a tapestry of suspicion that even the most practical villagers couldn't ignore. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a cushioned wicker chair on the terrace, sipped her tea with measured calm, her sharp eyes scanning the gathering before her. The air was thick with the scent of roses and the murmur of Hollywood glamour. But beneath it all, she sensed a darker pulse. Dolly Bantry, her dear friend and hostess, bustled over, her cheeks flushed with the effort of playing the perfect lady of the manor. Jane, I swear, this film business is more drama off-screen than on. Vivian's invited half the village to this wretched dinner, and I'm run ragged keeping up appearances. She adjusted her pearl necklace, a nervous tick Miss Marple noted with interest. It's the nature of such gatherings, Dolly, Miss Marple replied, her voice soft but laced with quiet authority. People wear masks, and the cracks in them show most when they're trying to impress. Her knitting needles clicked rhythmically, a counterpoint to the chatter of the arriving guests. The dinner was Vivienne Leroux's idea, a grand affair to soothe the village's jitters and cement her status as a benevolent star. The long dining hall of Gossington Hall had been transformed into a vision of opulence. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above a mahogany table draped in white linen. Silver candelabras flickered, and porcelain plates gleamed with the promise of a 5-course meal. Vivienne, resplendent in a crimson gown that clung to her like a second skin, floated among the guests, her laughter bright but brittle. Miss Marple, ever observant, noted the faint tremor in Vivienne's hand as she greeted Mrs. Gibbs, the village busybody, and the way her eyes darted toward her husband, Roland Vane, who stood brooding by the fireplace. Roland, a man whose once handsome features were now etched with worry, clutched a glass of whiskey as if it were a lifeline. His directorial career hung by a thread Miss Marple had gathered from Dolly's gossip, and this film, The Ladies' Reckoning, was his last chance to reclaim glory. Beside him, Leonard Drake, the brooding co-star, cut a striking figure in a tailored suit. But his jaw was tight, his gaze fixed on Vivienne with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Clara, recently released from Dr. Haydock's care after her sedative-induced collapse, hovered at the edges, her pale face half hidden by a curtain of dark hair. She clutched a shawl tightly, as if warding off a chill only she could feel. The guest list was a curious mix. Village notables like the vicar, Mr. Clement, and his wife, Griselda, mingled awkwardly with the film crew. Tom the Grip, a weary man with a perpetual scowl, Jenny, the nervous seamstress who darted glances at the silverware, and a handful of minor actors whose names Miss Marple hadn't bothered to memorize. The air buzzed with forced pleasantries, but the weight of recent events, the shattered mirror, the rune, Clara's poisoning, hung over the room like a storm cloud. As the first course, a delicate consomme, was served, Vivienne rose, her wine glass catching the candlelight. "My dear friends," she began, her voice a practiced melody, "I know the past few days have been unsettling, but tonight, let us celebrate art, community, and the magic of storytelling. To St. Mary Mead." She raised her glass, and the guests followed suit. Though Miss Marple noted Clara's hesitation, her fingers tightening around her own glass, the toast was barely complete when Vivienne's expression faltered. Her hand wavered, and the glass slipped, red wine splashing across the pristine tablecloth like blood. A collective gasp rose, followed by a nervous titter from Griselda. "Oh, dear, what a mess," she exclaimed, but Vivienne's eyes were wide, her breath uneven. "It's nothing," Vivienne said quickly, forcing a smile. "Clumsy of me. Do carry on." But her voice cracked, and she sank into her chair, her hand brushing her throat as if something bitter lingered there. Miss Marple's knitting paused. She leaned toward Dolly, whispering, "Did you see her face, Dolly? That was no mere spill." Her eyes flicked to the glass, now resting on its side, the remaining wine pooling into the fabric. A faint, acrid scent reached her, barely noticeable. Amidst the aroma of roasted pheasant and rosemary, she set her needles aside and rose, her small frame moving with surprising purpose toward the table's head. "Mrs. Bantry, might I have a word with the staff?" Miss Marple asked, her tone polite but firm. Dolly, catching the glint in her friend's eye, nodded and signaled the butler, a dour man named Hawkins, to assist in the kitchen. Miss Marple examined the spilled glass, which Hawkins had retrieved. At her request, she dipped a finger near the rim, careful not to touch the liquid, and sniffed. The acrid note was unmistakably a chemical taint, subtle but deliberate. This wine was tampered with, she said quietly to Dolly, who had followed her. Not enough to kill, perhaps, but enough to cause distress. We must find the bottle it came from. Dolly's eyes widened. Poison? Again? Jane, this is becoming positively gothic. Gothic or not, someone in this house is playing a dangerous game, Miss Marple replied, her lips pursing. And I suspect they meant to target someone specific, though whether it was Vivian or another, I'm not yet certain. Back in the dining hall, the mood had shifted. Vivian, pale but composed, was laughing off the incident, regaling the vicar with a tale of her early days in Hollywood. Yet Miss Marple noticed the way her eyes darted to Clara, who sat silently, her untouched soup cooling before her. Leonard, meanwhile, was deep in conversation with Tom, their voices low and urgent. Roland drained his whiskey and called for another, his movements jerky, as if he sensed the noose tightening. Miss Marple returned to her seat, her mind racing. The prophecy, with its talk of betrayal and death, was no mere superstition. It was a script, carefully crafted to sow fear. The rune, the mirror, the sedative in Clara's system, and now this tainted wine all pointed to a mind that thrived on manipulation. But whose? Clara, with her cryptic notes and sudden collapse. Leonard, whose brooding intensity hid something unspoken. Or Roland, whose desperation might drive him to sabotage his own production. As the main course arrived, roast pheasant with a cranberry glaze, Miss Marple struck up a conversation with Jenny, the seamstress, who sat to her left. You must find this all quite thrilling, my dear, she said, her tone grandmotherly. Working with such glamorous people. Jenny's fork trembled slightly. It's overwhelming. Miss Marple. Everyone's so tense. And after that, mirror broke. Well, it's like the whole set's cursed. Cursed? Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes keen. Do you believe in such things? Jenny hesitated, glancing toward Tom, who was now laughing loudly at a crude joke from a minor actor. Not really, but things keep going wrong. Props missing, scripts changed. And Clara, she's been acting so strange since that night at the inn. Miss Marple nodded, filing the observation away. Jenny's nervousness was genuine, but her quick glance at Tom suggested she knew more than she let on. Tell me, dear, do you ever help with the catering? Pouring wine, perhaps? Jenny's cheeks flushed. Oh no, that's Hawkins' job. I stick to costumes. I'd be hopeless with all those fancy bottles. Her laugh was forced, and Miss Marple smiled kindly, letting the matter drop for now. The dinner progressed, but the atmosphere grew heavier. Vivian's laughter became shrill, her anecdotes veering into tangents about betrayal and lost friends. You know, she said suddenly, her voice carrying across the table, in Hollywood, everyone's your friend until you're no longer useful. Then they turn, like wolves. Her eyes locked on Roland, who froze, his glass halfway to his lips. Vivian, darling, perhaps another story, Roland said, his tone strained. But Vivian ignored him, her gaze drifting to the tall windows, where the night pressed against the glass. I saw her, you know, she murmured, almost to herself, in the mirror, before it broke. A face, not mine, watching me. The table fell silent. Mrs. Gibbs clutched her napkin, her eyes wide. You don't mean a ghost? She whispered, her voice trembling with delicious fear. Nonsense, Roland snapped, slamming his glass down. It's the stress of the shoot. Vivian, you need rest. But Miss Marple's attention was elsewhere. Clara, who had been silent all evening, was staring at Vivian, her face a mask of conflicting emotions: fear, anger, perhaps guilt. Miss Marple leaned toward Dolly. "That girl knows something," she whispered, "and I suspect it's tied to those letters she showed me at the inn." As dessert, a rich chocolate torte was served. Miss Marple excused herself, claiming a need for fresh air. In truth, she slipped into the butler's pantry, where Hawkins was decanting another bottle of wine. "Mr. Hawkins," she said, her voice gentle but commanding, "might I see the bottle from which Miss LaRue's wine was poured?" Hawkins, a man of few words, nodded and retrieved a half-empty bottle of Bordeaux from a rack. Miss Marple examined it closely, noting a faint smudge on the label, a fingerprint, perhaps, or something more deliberate. She produced a small handkerchief and carefully wiped the rim, tucking the cloth into her sleeve for later inspection. "Thank you, Mr. Hawkins. And tell me, did anyone handle this bottle before you served it?" Hawkins frowned, his brow furrowing. "Only the kitchen staff, ma'am. And, well, Miss Clara was in here earlier, fetching a glass of water. Said she was feeling faint." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Faint, you say? Interesting." She thanked him and returned to the dining hall, where the mood had soured further. Vivian was now arguing with Leonard, her voice low but venomous. "You think you can rewrite my life, don't you?" she hissed. "You and your precious script. Changes." Leonard's face darkened. "You're paranoid, Vivian. It's just a film." Miss Marple resumed her seat, her mind piecing together the fragments. The wine had been tampered with, but the target was unclear. Vivian's erratic behavior suggested she might have been the intended victim. Yet Clara's presence in the pantry raised questions. Was Clara the poisoner, seeking revenge for some unknown slight? Or was she, too, a target? Her earlier collapse a warning that had failed to silence her. As the evening drew to a close, the guests dispersed, their chatter subdued. Vivian retired early, claiming a headache, while Roland lingered by the fireplace, staring into the flames. Clara slipped away without a word, and Miss Marple noted Tom's quick exit, his scowl deeper than usual. Leonard, however, lingered, his eyes following Miss Marple as she gathered her shawl. "Miss Marple," he said, approaching her as the room emptied. His voice was low, urgent. "I need to tell you something. I saw someone tampering with the wine earlier. In the pantry, before dinner." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose, though her expression remained serene. "Did you, Mr. Drake? And who might that have been?" Leonard's jaw tightened, his eyes darting toward the door. I can't say. Not yet. It's too dangerous." He turned abruptly and strode out, leaving Miss Marple alone with her thoughts. She sat back, her knitting needles resuming their steady rhythm. The poisoned chalice, the shattered mirror, the rune, all were threads in a tapestry of deceit. Someone in Gossington Hall was weaving a dangerous game, and Miss Marple was determined to unravel it before the prophecy's shadow claimed another victim. The night deepened, and outside, the wind howled, as if echoing the secrets buried within the hall's ancient walls. Chapter 6. The co-star's first late summer sun dipped low over St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns of Gossington Hall. The air was thick with the scent of blooming roses, and the hum of excitement from the film crew bustling about the estate. The production of The Crimson Veil, Vivian LaRue's latest cinematic venture, was in full swing. But beneath the surface of glamour and grace paint, a current of unease rippled through the set. Miss Jane Marple, ever the quiet observer, sat on a wicker chair at the edge of the makeshift filming area, her knitting needles clicking softly as she watched the scene unfold. Her sharp eyes missed nothing, not the strained smiles, not the hurried whispers, and certainly not the tremor in Leonard Drake's voice as he stormed away from a heated exchange with the director, Roland Vane. The set was a whirlwind of activity. Cameras on cranes swooped low, capturing Vivian's luminous face as she delivered a monologue, her golden curls catching the light like a halo. Yet, the magic of Hollywood seemed tarnished today. Miss Marple's attention drifted from Vivian's performance to Leonard, the brooding co-star, whose dark eyes darted nervously toward the crew. His argument with Roland had been loud enough to draw glances, something about a script change that cut too close to the bone. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Interesting, she thought, her needles pausing mid-stitch. Leonard's agitation was more than artistic temperament, it was fear. As the director called cut, and the crew erupted into motion, Miss Marple's gaze settled on a figure lurking near the prop table. Tom, the grip, a weary man with a perpetual scowl. He was muttering to himself, his hands fidgeting with a coil of rope. Miss Marple had overheard him earlier, grumbling about a cursed production to a lighting technician. His words had been dismissed as superstition, but Miss Marple knew better than to ignore the mutterings of the discontented. Superstition, after all, often cloaked deeper truths. "Jane, you look positively absorbed," came a cheerful voice, interrupting her thoughts. Dolly Bantry, her friend and hostess at Gossington Hall, plopped down beside her, a glass of lemonade in hand. Is it the glamour of the cinema, or something more Marplesque? Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes still on Leonard, who was now pacing near a cluster of oak trees. "Oh, Dolly, the cinema is all very well, but I find people far more fascinating. They tell stories without ever opening their mouths." Dolly chuckled, fanning herself with a script. "You and your people watching. I swear, you could write a novel just from the way someone holds a teacup. So, what's caught your eye today? Not that dreadful prophecy nonsense again, I hope." Miss Marple's fingers resumed their knitting, the soft clack of needles a steady rhythm. "Prophecies, my dear, are only as powerful as the hands that wield them. But I do wonder about young Mr. Drake. He seems unsettled." Dolly followed her gaze. "Leonard, oh, he's a bundle of nerves, isn't he? All those smoldering looks for the camera. But off-screen, he's like a cat in a thunderstorm. I heard him arguing with Roland about some scene, something about a scandal. Do you think it's true, Jane? All that gossip about Vivian's past." "Gossip is like a poorly baked cake," Miss Marple replied, her tone mild but her eyes sharp. "It rises quickly but often lacks substance. Still, I find it curious that Mr. Drake is so affected by a mere script change. One wonders what nerve it touched." Before Dolly could respond, a commotion erupted near the set. A young assistant, her face pale, rushed toward Roland, holding a film canister aloft like a trophy. "Mr. Vane, you need to see this," she cried, her voice trembling. The crew parted, and Miss Marple leaned forward, her knitting forgotten. Roland, his face already flushed from the argument, snatched the canister and pried it open. His expression darkened as he pulled out a strip of film, holding it to the light. "Good heavens," he muttered, loud enough for Miss Marple to hear. "Who did this?" The crew gathered, murmuring, as Roland displayed the film. Even from her vantage point, Miss Marple could see the defacement. A jagged, crimson rune scratched across Vivian's close-up, marring her flawless features. The same rune, Miss Marple noted, that had been carved into the shattered mirror shard Clara had clutched 2 nights before. A chill ran through her. not from the evening breeze, but from the realization that someone was weaving this prophecy with deliberate intent. "Jane, that's the same symbol, isn't it?" Dolly whispered, her eyes wide. "The one you said meant deceit." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. "Indeed, Dolly. Someone is going to great lengths to keep this prophecy alive. But why?" As Roland barked orders to secure the remaining film reels, Miss Marple's attention returned to Leonard. He stood apart from the crowd, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his gaze fixed on the defaced film. His face was a mask of dread, and Miss Marple's intuition prickled. "He knows something," she thought, "and he's terrified." That evening, Gossington Hall was abuzz with the day's drama. The dining room, converted into a temporary lounge for the film's principal players, hummed with conversation, though the mood was far from festive. Vivian, resplendent in a silk gown, held court at one end of the room, her laughter bright but brittle. Roland, nursing a glass of brandy, conferred with the cinematographer in hushed tones. Clara, recently returned from the inn and still pale, hovered near the door, her eyes darting nervously, and Leonard was nowhere to be seen. Miss Marple, invited as Dolly's guest, sat quietly in a corner, her knitting a perfect excuse to observe without drawing attention. She had just begun to wonder about Leonard's absence when the door swung open, and he entered, his face ashen. He made a beeline for Vivian, but before he could reach her, Miss Marple rose, intercepting him with the grace of a village spinster who knew precisely how to position herself. "Mr. Drake," she said, her voice soft but firm, "you seem troubled. Might I have a word?" Leonard froze, his dark eyes flickering with unease. "Miss Marple, there's nothing to discuss. Just a long day." "Oh, I quite understand," she said, her tone disarming. "Long days can weigh heavily, especially when one carries secrets. But you know, in my little village, I've found that secrets have a way of unraveling." His jaw tightened, and for a moment, she thought he might bolt. But then, as if the weight of his fear was too much to bear, alone, he leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "Miss Marple, I'm being blackmailed." Miss Marple's expression remained serene, though her mind sharpened like a blade. "Blackmailed, you say? That's a serious matter. Perhaps you'd care to share more over a cup of tea. Perhaps." It's remarkable how tea can loosen the tongue. Reluctantly, Leonard followed her to a quiet alcove, where a small table held a teapot and cups. Dolly, sensing Miss Marple's intent, made herself scarce, though not without a curious glance. As Miss Marple poured the tea, she studied Leonard's face, the tight lines around his mouth, the way his fingers drummed nervously against his knee. He was a man on the edge, and she intended to find out why. "It started a week ago," he began, his voice low. "Letters slipped under my door. At the inn, they mentioned things from my past. An affair, years ago, before I was anyone. It was messy, but I thought it was buried. The letters said if I didn't pay, they'd tell the press and Vivian. It'd ruin me." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes never leaving his. "And these letters, they mentioned the prophecy." He nodded, his hands trembling as he reached for his cup. "They called it the star's betrayal. Said I'd be the one to fall if I didn't comply. And then that rune. It was on the letters, just like the one on the film today." Chapter 10. The stars collapseth late afternoon sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns of Gossington Hall. The air was thick with the scent of blooming roses and the faint hum of anticipation as the Film crew bustled about, preparing for another day of shooting. Vivian Leroux, the silver-screened siren whose rival had set the village abuzz, stood at the center of it all, her auburn hair catching the light like a halo. But her usual radiance was dimmed, her face pale and her movements jittery as she rehearsed a scene on the grand staircase of the hall. Miss Jane Marple, seated discreetly in a wicker chair near the edge of the set, whereupon with her usual calm, her sharp eyes missing nothing, the staircase, a sweeping marble affair with an ornate wrought iron balustrade, was the focal point of today's scene, a dramatic confrontation between Vivian's character, Lady Eleanor, and her scheming brother, played by Leonard Drake. The crew had dressed the set meticulously. Crystal chandeliers gleamed, and a massive gilt-framed mirror hung at the landing, reflecting the flurry of activity below. Miss Marple's needles clicked rhythmically, a counterpoint to the sharp claps of the director. Roland Vane, as he called for another take. "Vivian, darling, more fire." Roland barked from behind the camera, his voice strained with the weight of a production teetering on the edge of chaos. "Eleanor's unraveling, let us feel it." Vivian nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. She ascended the stairs again, her emerald green gown trailing behind her like a cascade of liquid jade. Leonard, brooding and intense in a tailored suit, followed, his lines dripping with venom. The scene was meant to be a crescendo of betrayal, but Vivian's delivery faltered. Her hands trembled as she gripped the banister, and her eyes darted to the mirror above, as if expecting it to shatter again, as it had at the welcome fête days ago. Miss Marple tilted her head, noting the flicker of fear in Vivian's gaze. The actress had been unraveling since the mirror incident, her poise chipped away by cryptic threats, a poisoned chalice, and the lingering shadow of the prophecy etched into that antique glass. "A star shall fall by betrayal's hand." The village whispered of curses, but Miss Marple knew better. Curses were the stuff of superstition. Betrayal, however, was all too human. The take ended abruptly when Vivian stumbled mid-line, clutching the banister for support. I can't," she gasped, her voice barely audible. The crew froze, and Roland's face darkened. "Cut," he shouted, striding toward her. "Vivian, what's wrong? We're behind schedule as it is." But before she could answer, a sharp cry tore from her throat. Her knees buckled, and she pitched forward, tumbling down the last few steps of the staircase. The crew gasped, and Dolly Bantry, who had been hovering near Miss Marple, leapt to her feet. "Oh, heavens!" she exclaimed, rushing forward. Miss Marple set her knitting aside with deliberate calm, her mind already racing. Vivian lay crumpled at the base of the stairs, her gown fanned out like spilled ink. Roland reached her first, kneeling beside her. "Vivian, are you hurt?" His voice cracked, revealing a rare glimpse of genuine concern beneath his brusque exterior. Vivian's eyes fluttered open, her breath shallow. "Someone pushed me," she whispered, her voice trembling with accusation. "I felt it, a hand on my back." The crew exchanged uneasy glances, and murmurs rippled through the set. Miss Marple stepped forward, her small frame cutting through the chaos with quiet authority. "Mrs. Bantry, please fetch Dr. Haydock at once," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Dolly nodded and hurried off, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Miss Marple knelt beside Vivian, her eyes scanning the actress's pale face. "Miss Leroux, can you tell me exactly what happened?" she asked gently. Vivian's gaze darted to the staircase, then to the mirror above. "I was halfway up, rehearsing. I felt a hand cold, deliberate push me from behind. I swear it." "Miss Marple, someone wants me dead," Roland scoffed, though his eyes betrayed unease. Vivian, you're exhausted. There was no one behind. Leonard was at the bottom of the stairs, and the crew was all down here. Miss Marple's lips pursed. She rose and examined the staircase, her fingers brushing the smooth marble steps. Near the 5th step, she paused, crouching to inspect a faint scuff mark, a crescent-shaped smear of black, like the heel of a boot. Curious, she murmured, her mind cataloging the detail. The mark was fresh, and its position suggested someone had stood close behind Vivian. But the staircase had been cleared during the take, or had it? Dr. Haydock arrived minutes later, his medical bag in hand. The crew parted to let him through, and he knelt beside Vivian, checking her pulse and examining her for injuries. No broken bones, thankfully, he said, his voice steady. But you're shaken, Miss LaRue. I'd recommend rest and a thorough check at the hospital to rule out a concussion. Vivian shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. I won't leave the hall. Not with whoever did this still here. Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Dr. Haydock, who gave a slight nod, understanding her unspoken request to keep Vivian calm. Very well, Miss Marple said, her voice soothing. But you must rest, my dear. We'll ensure you're safe. As Roland and a crew member helped Vivian to a nearby chaise, Miss Marple beckoned Dolly aside. Mrs. Bantry, did you notice anyone near the staircase during the take? She asked quietly. Dolly frowned, her brow furrowing. No, Jane. The crew was all below, and Leonard was at the foot of the stairs, as Roland said. But, well, it's a big hall. Someone could have slipped behind the set, couldn't they? Indeed, Miss Marple replied, her eyes narrowing. Someone could have. The set was cleared, and filming was halted for the day. Miss Marple lingered, her gaze sweeping the hall. The mirror on the landing gleamed, its surface unmarred since its replacement after the fête. Yet Vivian's fear of it lingered, as did the prophecy's shadow. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Clara, the assistant who had fled and returned, only to be found unconscious from a sedative. Clara had mentioned Vivian's past rivalry with a forgotten actress, Elise Morrow, whose name had surfaced in village gossip. Could Elise's shadow stretch this far? Miss Marple made her way to Vivian's dressing room, where the actress had been moved for privacy. The room was a study in opulence. Velvet curtains, a vanity strewn with makeup and jewelry, and a rack of glittering costumes. Vivian sat before the mirror, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Miss Marple, she said, her voice low, you believe me, don't you? About the push. I believe you felt something. Miss LaRue, Miss Marple replied carefully, but we must consider all possibilities. Tell me, have you had any recent contact with Elise Morrow? Vivian's face paled further. If that were possible. Elise. Why would you mention her? She's been gone for years. A nobody, really, after what happened. And what did happen? Miss Marple pressed, her tone gentle, but firm. Vivian hesitated, her fingers twisting a silk scarf. It was ages ago, in Hollywood. Elise and I were up for the same role, a big break. I got it, and she didn't. She claimed I sabotaged her, spread rumors about her to the studio, but I didn't. She just couldn't handle the rejection. She left the industry, vanished. Why does it matter now? Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with quiet intensity. Because, my dear, old wounds have a way of festering. And someone here seems to know that. A knock interrupted them. It was Clara, her face drawn but resolute. She had recovered from her ordeal, though her eyes still carried a haunted look. Miss Marple, I heard about Vivian. Is she all right? She'll be fine with rest, Miss Marple said, studying Clara closely. But I'd like to speak with you, Clara, about Elise Morrow. Clara stiffened, her hand brushing the sleeve of her cardigan. Elise, I told you what I know. She was Vivian's rival, years ago. I found some old clippings about her in the hall's library. Clippings you didn't mention before, Miss Marple said, her voice mild but pointed. And you've been through quite an ordeal yourself, haven't you? The sedative, the threatening letters. Perhaps you know more than you've shared. Clara's eyes darted to Vivian, then back to Miss Marple. I don't know what you mean. I've told you everything. Have you? Miss Marple said, her tone soft but unyielding. Then perhaps you can explain why you were seen near the staircase just before Vivian's fall. Vivian gasped, and Clara's face drained of color. I wasn't. I was in the costume room, helping Jenny with the gowns. Miss Marple raised a hand, her expression calm. No need to distress yourself, Clara. I only wish to understand. You see, someone left a mark on the stairs, a scuff, quite distinct, and I suspect it wasn't an accident. Clara's hands trembled, but she said nothing. Vivian, however, leaned forward, her voice sharp. Clara, if you know something, tell us. I could have died. The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to choke on. Miss Marple's eyes flicked between the two women, her mind piecing together fragments. The scuff mark, Vivian's fear, Clara's evasiveness, and the specter of Elise Morrow. She recalled the threatening letters, signed with the rune for deceit, and the rare book in the hall's library that linked to it. Someone was weaving a web, and Vivian was at its center. But why? Miss LaRue, Miss Marple said at last, I suggest you remain here with Dr. Haydock's nurse for now. Clara, I'd like you to accompany me to the staircase. There's something I'd like to examine further. Clara hesitated, then nodded, her shoulders slumping. As they left the dressing room, Miss Marple caught a glimpse of Roland in the hallway, his face etched with worry as he spoke in hushed tones to Leonard Drake. The co-star's brooding intensity seemed to have deepened, his eyes shadowed with something more than exhaustion. Miss Marple filed the observation away, her mind buzzing with possibilities. The staircase loomed before them, its marble steps gleaming under the chandelier's light. Miss Marple knelt again at the scuff mark, her fingers tracing its edges. Clara, she said, her voice conversational, you've been with Miss LaRue for some time, haven't you? You must know her history well, her triumphs, her enemies. Clara shifted uncomfortably. I suppose so. She's not an easy person to work for, but she's brilliant. Her past, though it's complicated, Hollywood's full of grudges. Indeed, Miss Marple said, rising, and some grudges follow us, don't they? Like shadows in a mirror. Clara's eyes widened, but before she could respond, a shout echoed from the hall's entrance. It was Jenny, the young seamstress, her face flushed with panic. Miss Marple, come quick, there's something in Vivian's dressing room. Miss Marple and Clara hurried back, finding Jenny standing outside the door, clutching a folded piece of paper. I found this under her vanity, Jenny said, her voice trembling. It wasn't there before. Miss Marple took the paper, unfolding it carefully. The message was written in a hurried scrawl, the ink smudged but legible. The betrayers. Time is near. The star will fall. Below the words was the now familiar rune, its jagged lines stark against the page. Vivian, still seated inside, gasped as Miss Marple showed her the note. It's happening, she whispered. The prophecy, it's Real? Nonsense, Miss Marple said firmly, though her eyes were grave. This is no prophecy. Miss Leroux, this is a person, a very real person with a very real motive, and I intend to find them. As the evening deepened, Miss Marple sat with Dolly in the Bantry's drawing room, sipping tea and recounting the day's events. It's all rather theatrical, isn't it? Dolly said, her eyes wide. Pushes on staircases, cryptic notes, runes. It's like one of Vivian's films. Precisely, Miss Marple said, her needles clicking. And that's what troubles me. It's too theatrical, too staged. Someone is orchestrating this, Dolly, to frighten Vivian or worse. And I suspect Elise Morrow's shadow looms larger than we know. Dolly leaned forward, her voice low. Do you think Elise is here, in St. Mary Mead? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with quiet certainty. I think, my dear, that someone wants us to believe she is. And that is where we shall start. The next morning, Miss Marple visited the village archives, a dusty room above the post office where Mrs. Gibbs, the local gossip and part-time archivist, kept records of St. Mary Mead's history. Elise Morrow, you say? Mrs. Gibbs said, peering over her spectacles. I remember her, vaguely. She stayed here years ago, before she went to Hollywood. Lived in that little cottage by the river, Rose Cottage. It was called. Odd girl, kept to herself. Did she have family here? Miss Marple asked, her tone casual. Not that I recall, Mrs. Gibbs said, rummaging through a box of yellowed papers. But there was a scandal when she left, something about a falling out with a friend. Never came back, far as I know. Miss Marple thanked her and made her way to Rose Cottage, now abandoned and overgrown with ivy. The windows were dark, the garden wild, but as she approached, she noticed a faint footprint in the mud near the gate, a small, narrow print, like a woman's shoe. Her lips pursed. Someone had been here, and recently. Inside, the cottage was a time capsule. Faded curtains, a cracked mirror above the fireplace, and a faint smell of damp. Miss Marple's eyes fell on a small table, where a single photograph lay, half hidden under a layer of dust. It showed two young women, arm in arm, smiling at the camera. One was unmistakably a younger Vivian Leroux, the other, with sharp cheekbones and intense eyes, could only be Elise Morrow. Miss Marple tucked the photograph into her handbag, her mind racing. The connection was clear now. Vivian and Elise had been friends, perhaps closer than Vivian had let on. A betrayal over a role, a lover, or something deeper had severed their bond, and now someone was using that past to unravel Vivian's present. Back at Gossington Hall, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Vivian refused to film, barricading herself in her dressing room. Roland was furious, barking orders at the crew, while Leonard paced the lawn, his face a mask of guilt and fear. Clara, meanwhile, had grown quieter, her eyes darting nervously whenever Miss Marple approached. That afternoon, Miss Marple gathered Roland, Leonard, Clara, and Jenny in the hall's library, a grand room lined with oak shelves and heavy drapes. Inspector Craddock, who had been called in after the fire, stood by the door, his notebook at the ready. I believe, Miss Marple began, her voice clear and steady, that we are dealing with a very clever individual, someone who knows Miss Leroux's past intimately and is using it to create fear and chaos. Roland crossed his arms. This is absurd, Miss Marple. Vivian's just overwrought. There's no proof anyone pushed her. On the contrary, Miss Marple said, producing the scuff-marked cloth she'd used to preserve the mark on the stairs. This mark suggests someone was close behind her. And this, she held up the coded note from the dressing room, was placed deliberately. To deepen her fear, Leonard shifted, his jaw tight. You're saying one of us did this? I'm saying, Miss Marple replied, that someone here knows more than they've shared. And I believe it ties to Elise Morrow. Clara flinched, and Miss Marple's eyes locked onto her. Clara, you've been remarkably silent about your own ordeal. The sedative, the letters, yet you returned to the hall, despite your fear. Why? Clara's hands twisted in her lap. I had to. Vivian needed me. Or, Miss Marple said softly, you needed to be here, to ensure the prophecy played out. The room went still. Vivian, who had joined them, gasped. Clara, you've been with me for years. Why would you? Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she said nothing. Miss Marple pressed on. I found a photograph today, at Rose Cottage. It shows you, Miss LaRue, with Elise Morrow. Years ago, you were friends, weren't you? Until something broke that friendship. Vivian's face crumpled. Yes, she whispered. We were like sisters, but she wanted that role, the one that made me. I didn't sabotage her, I swear, but she believed I did. She left Hollywood, left me. I never saw her again. Miss Marple nodded. And now someone is using that pain, her pain, to hurt you. Someone who knows the truth. The library door creaked, and Jenny stepped forward, her face pale. Miss Marple, I need to tell you something. I overheard Clara talking on the phone last night. She mentioned Elise said she was closer than we think. Clara's head snapped up, her eyes blazing. That's a lie. I never. But Miss Marple raised a hand, silencing her. Clara, I don't believe you're the mastermind here. But you know something. And if you don't share it, someone else may be hurt. Clara's shoulders slumped, and she buried her face in her hands. All right, she whispered. Elise, she's alive. I've been in touch with her. She's not here, but she sent me the letters. Told me to plant them. She said Vivian deserved to feel her pain. Vivian's eyes widened. Elise, she's behind this. Clara nodded, tears streaming down her face. She's sick, Miss Marple. Bitter. She wanted revenge, but I didn't know it would go this far. The push, the fires. I thought it was just to scare her. Miss Marple's expression softened, but her mind was already moving to the next piece of the puzzle. Where is Elise now? Clara, I don't know, Clara said, her voice breaking. She stopped answering my calls yesterday. The room fell silent, the weight of the revelation settling over them. Miss Marple glanced at Craddock, who nodded, already planning to trace Elise's whereabouts. But her thoughts were elsewhere on the coded message. The scuff mark, and the photograph. Elise might be the architect, but someone else was acting on her behalf, here in St. Mary Mead, and Miss Marple suspected they were closer than anyone realized. As the group dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes on the library's fireplace, where a small mirror hung above the mantel. Its surface was clear, unmarred. But she couldn't shake the feeling that it held secrets yet to be revealed. The prophecy was a lie, a human scheme, but its danger was all too real. And somewhere, in the shadows of Gossington Hall, the betrayer was watching, waiting for the star to fall.